Today we're getting under the hood of women's health with Mette the CEO and founder of Mymee, a leader in personalized trials and care for autoimmune non-responders. Mette's lifelong journey with autoimmune disease started at age 14. Mette is getting under the hood of autoimmune disease.
I was first diagnosed with psoriasis at the age of 14, and subsequently I was diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis, ulcerative colitis, Sjogren's disease, thyroid disease, Hashimoto's in my case. I had a lot of sort of side diagnoses, which was some liver involvement, PCOS, which is infertility. Had something called Syndrome X, which basically meant that my blood sugar was unstable. I was treated as a type 2 diabetic. It's quite normal that people have more than one autoimmune diagnosis. So I got my first diagnosis at 14. I got psoriasis. It was literally waking up with like little spots from head to toe. We didn't need to go see a doctor because my grandfather had psoriasis, and so I was sort of in the know. Um, Less so when I was in my 20s. I spent the first half of my 20s basically in and out of doctor's office and ER rooms without much understanding of what was going on. It was mostly leaving me with the "it's all in your head," which actually led me to go see a therapist when I arrived in Denmark in my mid-20s, because I was so frustrated with this feeling a little bit crazy, and was essentially hoping for a hypochondriac diagnosis. I remember about halfway into the session, she goes, "I don't know if you have anything else to talk about, but the one thing I can promise you is that you're not a hypochondriac." And that was the first time somebody actually sort of acknowledged the way that I felt. Um, but I was in a fortunate position. I grew up in Denmark. We had, paid health care, and my parents were in a situation where they could help with whatever was needed. So I even went to see specialists outside of the system and even outside of the country. And so that journey was not necessarily easy, but I mean, in hindsight, once you feel like there's something wrong with you, you sort of have to see it through, right? With autoimmune disease, affects everything. It affects how you feel, how you think, what you're able to do. And I went from modeling to being overweight, from being an A+ student to being unable to read a book. And I think the most sort of detrimental part to your life is that there's such an unpredictability. You never know when you're going to feel good. And so you become sort of the flaky friend that never signs up until last minute for anything. And in hindsight, there's a lot of things I would have done different. One of them was not being so alone with how I felt. When I got my sort of like stepping into the limelight in terms of sharing my story more broadly, a lot of my dear friends said, "Wow, we had no idea that you were that sick." And I think it's a very common practice among people who are chronically ill, is that you sort of make your way through and you only show up in public when you're able to. And so nobody really sees the flip side of the coin. It makes you feel like you're missing out. Like there's a lot of things that you miss out on. Um, you know, there was no boyfriends, there was no beach trips, there was a lot of things that just there wasn't energy and room for. And I remember when I many years later reversed my symptoms and was really at a place in my mid of my 30s where holy smoke, I can sort of like get a fresh start. And that is probably the time that I was the most depressed, because I felt like, wow, what would have happened if I had not had all of this for the last 20 years? Like, what could I have done with my life? And I remember my mom saying, think about it like you ran a marathon with a backpack, and now you can put down the backpack. But you have to think about it as life being lighter, not heavier because of the burden that you've gone through. And in that moment, it sort of became clear that I could sort of mourn what hadn't been, or I could live life from that moment onwards the way that I would have wished I could have done all of my life. There's different things that trigger sort of motivation in people. And I'm an economist, and my doctors told me that they were quote unquote happy with my numbers. And that was just not acceptable. And so, to a large extent, in that moment, I went from being disempowered as a patient to empowered as a human being. And what what happened was also I didn't know much about healthcare. And so I applied what I understood, which was process optimization. And so in many ways, we jokingly said in the early days, like, this should be Toyota Health, because it's essentially sort of like this just-in-time agile management process just applied to my own body. And I think the one thing that I didn't actually know at the time, but in hindsight is very clear, is that I view the world in patterns. I always look for patterns. And so why me? To a large extent was probably because of the way that my brain is wired. I remember training coaches, and they were like, "But how are you seeing it?" And I'm like, just look at the colors and the data, and like it's clear as day." And it was actually quite hard to show others how my brain was working. I have a really kind of cute anecdote about it, because my brother a couple of years ago during the pandemic was cooking and talking to me on FaceTime, and his son, who is like a duplicate of me, was lying on the floor doing a puzzle with the gray side, like the back side up. And I said to him, why don't you make the picture on the box? It's much easier. And he said, but Aunt Mette, I already did that side. Now I'm doing the other side. And so I was joking with my brother around, how peculiar of a kid he was. And then my father walked by, and not really to me and my brother, but more so to himself, said, huh, I haven't seen a kid do that since Mette. And my brother, of course, laughed a lot at this, but it also sort of stood out to me as we are all, sort of wired in each our own way. And that this pattern making that was always apparently a part of who I was became sort of my secret weapon in terms of figuring out what was going on with myself and ultimately thousands of others. When I founded Mymee, it was really down to sort of like what I knew, right? And the one thing that is overshadowing a lot when you're an autoimmune patient is feeling that you're not being understood, not being heard. And so, yes, we're using technology to both extract data from people's day-to-day life. We're using machines to sort of look at the causality between what you do and how it affects your symptoms. But more importantly, we are using a care team of humans that have all gone through autoimmune disease to ensure that nothing is lost in translation, that people can talk in their own language and they feel seen and heard. I don't think healthcare has necessarily up until today figured out what it takes to understand what goes into disease. But more so than anything, they've not understood how to extract the right information. And so asking the right questions is not a small thing. I think one of the most important things is actually for women to listen to their gut. I think we have been, unfortunately, growing up in a society where the doctor will see you now is a very powerful message, and people tend to listen sometimes more to what they're being told they should feel than how they actually feel. And being told it's all in your head will consequently actually make you feel like you can't trust your own intuition. And in my opinion, that's anyone's superpower. And so if you don't trust your gut, you'll get robbed of the most important thing you own, which is your superpower.